They say if you want to catch a thief, follow the money. I never thought I'd end up chasing $75,000 through fake invoices, secret meetings, and one HOA president's web of lies, but here we are. It all started last spring, during the annual HOA budget meeting. I live in a quiet suburb called Meadowbrook Heights, a nice place, full of families, retirees, and the occasional overzealous HOA board member. It's the kind of place where lawns are manicured, garage doors match the shutters, and everything runs, a little too perfectly. Our HOA president, Marla Jennings, stood at the front of the community center that evening, glossy binder in hand, with her signature tight smile. This year, she announced, we'll be raising dues by 15% to fund upcoming community projects, beautification, playground upgrades, and security enhancements. The words sounded reasonable. But something about the way she said it, so practiced, so polished, made my instincts twitch. I'm not just a skeptical guy. I'm a forensic accountant. Numbers are my native language. And when they don't add up, I feel it in my bones. After the meeting, I stopped by the front to ask a few questions. What's the breakdown on these projects? Do we have bids? A timeline? I asked politely. Marla didn't flinch. All of it is outlined in the proposal, which will be posted online next week, she said. We're still finalizing the vendor quotes. I nodded. But here's the thing, she said the same thing last year, when dues were raised by 10%. Back then, they promised new street lamps. We got 2. On the same block. And somehow that cost $18,000. So this time, I decided I wasn't going to let it go. The next day, I requested access to the HOA's financial records, which, under state law, they have to provide to any member. A week passed. No response. I sent a follow-up. Nothing. Then, finally, I got an envelope in the mail. Inside were 3 pages, poorly photocopied, with rows blacked out. For privacy. 3 pages for a full year of financials? I've seen thicker takeout menus. Something was definitely off. I started asking neighbors if they'd seen any of these so-called projects happening. Most hadn't. One told me he remembered seeing a couple of guys painting a fence near the tennis courts 3 months ago. That was it. Then I bumped into Carol, a retired schoolteacher who's lived in Meadowbrook since it was built. She invited me in for tea and shared something interesting. They've been saying they'll replace the pool deck for 2 years now, she told me. But it's still cracked, and my grandson tripped on it last summer. That's when I started to suspect the truth. Either the HOA was grossly mismanaging funds, or someone was pocketing the money. I started collecting newsletters and announcements from the past 3 years, comparing what was promised with what had actually been done. Out of a dozen proposed projects, only 2 were completed, and both were minor, painting the clubhouse doors and planting some shrubs near the sign. The rest? Still in progress. That night, I pulled up the county's online vendor database and searched for the contractors listed in the budget. Only 2 of them were registered businesses. The others? Nothing. No records. No licenses. No digital footprint. That was a red flag the size of a football field. I created a spreadsheet and began documenting every transaction I could find, matching it with physical work done. It quickly became clear that the amounts didn't make sense. For example, the HOA had supposedly spent $12,500 to repaint the community center, except the building hadn't been painted in years. I even found a date on the old paint can in the storage shed, 2019. My neighbor Todd, who works in construction, took a walk with me around the neighborhood. No way they spent $30,000 resurfacing this road, he said, kicking at a cracked curb. That's a Band-Aid patch job at best. Then I got a break. One of the receipts in the budget was listed as consulting fee, $6,250, Jenkins Development. That caught my attention. Jenkins is Marla's maiden name. I checked public business records. Jenkins Development is owned by Trevor Jenkins, her husband. Now I wasn't just dealing with bad accounting. This smelled like fraud. I made copies of everything and took them to my friend Monica, who's an attorney. "You've got enough here to make some serious noise," she said. "But be careful. HOAs can be like cults when they feel threatened." So I planned my next move carefully. I wasn't just going to confront them, I was going to expose them. Next up was the HOA's quarterly meeting. And I was ready to drop the first domino. The moment I walked out of that HOA meeting, I knew something was rotten. The board had just pushed through a 25% increase in our monthly dues, claiming it was urgently needed to fund upcoming community projects. But the way they danced around the specifics set off every alarm bell in my head. No budget breakdowns. No line items. Just vague talk about revitalizing the park, updating the clubhouse, and enhancing safety. And here's the thing, I'd lived in Crestwood Estates for almost 9 years. I'd seen the park get a new bench and 2 trash cans last spring. The clubhouse had barely been used since the pandemic. And the enhanced safety, they mentioned? A single motion sensor light they installed behind the pool, 3 months ago. Where exactly was this extra money going? Now, I'm not an accountant. I'm a schoolteacher. But I've got a nose for details and a real problem with being lied to. Especially when it's coming from the smug face of HOA President Brad Kent, a guy who looks like he bulk buys khakis and intimidation. So that night, I fired up my old laptop and started digging. I logged into the HOA's member portal, where supposedly all board meeting minutes and financial documents were posted. And sure, they were there, but it didn't take long to realize they were a mess. The budgets were vague summaries. $50,000 labeled as park improvements, with no breakdown. Another $35,000 marked for safety upgrades, but no description. And nearly $12,000 for board services. What exactly was a board service? A catered brunch? It all felt too convenient. And just as I was about to log off, something strange caught my eye. A new vendor listed in 3 different transactions totaling nearly $21,000, under the name Green Ridge Solutions, LLC. I didn't recognize that name from any neighborhood project. And it hadn't come up during the meeting. Curious, I Googled it. No website. No reviews. Just a small LLC listing in the next county over, registered 3 months ago. Something wasn't right. The next day, I took a drive. I headed out to the business address listed under the Green Ridge Solutions registry. It led me to a UPS store mailbox in a strip mall next to a laundromat. That was all I needed. Now I knew we weren't dealing with incompetence. We were dealing with fraud. I printed out what I had and brought it to my neighbor Diane. She'd been on the HOA board years ago and had resigned when Brad took over. She was sharp, principled, and the kind of person who labeled her spice rack alphabetically. When I showed her the vendor names and totals, her brow furrowed. Green Ridge? Never heard of it. And look at this. Why are we paying for consulting on a park upgrade that hasn't even started? Exactly. She went to her storage unit and pulled out old HOA budgets and newsletters from previous years. Together, we started comparing. Here's what we found. Last year, the HOA spent just $8,700 on park maintenance. This year? Over $50,000 budgeted, and $26,000 already spent. The new safety upgrade line item? A jump from $3,200 the previous year to $35,000 this year. And that mysterious board services category? It didn't exist in any previous budget. But here's the real kicker. One of the addresses on a check reimbursement matched a residential address, right here in Crestwood Estates. Brad Kent's rental property. The one he never disclosed during HOA elections. That night I didn't sleep. I sat with the documents sprawled across my kitchen table, highlighter in hand, cross-referencing every dollar I could track. By 2 a.m., I had a rough total, over $75,000 of dues redirected to suspicious vendors, inflated project budgets, and direct reimbursements tied to Brad and his inner circle. and no real improvements in the neighborhood to show for it. I needed a plan. The next morning, I met Diane at the local cafe. We brought in 2 more neighbors, Paul, a retired auditor, and Jen, a paralegal who once sued a used car dealer into bankruptcy. We formed what we jokingly called the Back Porch Committee. Paul went to work cross-checking vendor tax IDs and flagging unusual reimbursements. Jen started compiling legal grounds for action: misappropriation of funds, lack of transparency, possible mail fraud. And I kept digging. I requested a full copy of the HOA's general ledger, citing the open records clause in the HOA's own bylaws. Brad tried to stall me, sending a reply that the records would take time to prepare. That was fine. I had time. But I also knew they were sweating. That Friday, I got an anonymous email from a temporary account. The message read, "Check the contractor address on the clubhouse invoice. It's not what you think." That was all. I opened the PDF invoices again and zoomed in on the vendor address for a $14,000 security upgrade. It listed a unit number at a storage facility, rented under the name T. Kent, Brad's brother. That was the turning point. This wasn't just shady. It was systemic. They were laundering HOA dues through fake vendors and family-run shell companies. And now I had proof. I wasn't naive. I knew that exposing a fraud like this, especially one orchestrated from within the HOA, wouldn't be easy. People are slow to believe those they voted for could be crooked. But I also knew that facts had weight. And at this point, I had enough weight to crush a lawn gnome. So the Back Porch Committee got to work. We organized a private neighborhood meeting at Diane's house. No board members were invited. We printed packets detailing the suspicious transactions, highlighting fake vendors, unexplained reimbursements, and connections to Brad and his family. Each packet came with a QR code linking to a digital evidence folder, including spreadsheets, screenshots, and even photos of the UPS store mailbox and the storage unit address. 23 neighbors showed up. We didn't use scare tactics. We didn't get emotional. Paul calmly walked everyone through the numbers. Jen explained the legal implications, how this could qualify as financial misconduct and possibly mail fraud. Diane, ever the voice of reason, reminded everyone how far the neighborhood had fallen since Brad's presidency. By the time we were done, the room was buzzing. "I voted for him twice," one woman whispered. "I feel like an idiot." "This is theft," another man said, holding up the documents. "He's robbing us in broad daylight." But the best reaction came from an elderly couple, the Macmillans, who had lived in Crestwood Estates since the beginning. Mr. Macmillan just nodded and said, "Let's make some noise." The following Monday, a group of us submitted a formal petition to hold a special meeting of the members. According to the bylaws, if 20% of homeowners sign, the HOA is legally required to convene. We submitted 28 signatures. More than enough. Brad tried to dodge it. He claimed we hadn't followed proper submission protocol. Jen calmly cited the bylaws, line by line, and informed him that any delay would be considered obstruction. So he relented. The meeting was set for 2 weeks later, in the clubhouse, the very one he claimed had just received a $14,000 security upgrade we never saw. That gave us 14 days to prepare for war. Now, Brad wasn't stupid. Arrogant, yes. But not stupid. He must have caught wind of what we had, because suddenly, the HOA started pumping out newsletters and emails about exciting upgrades in the pipeline and ongoing community investments. They even posted a slideshow on the HOA website showcasing planned renderings of a future park pavilion, splash pad, and walking trail. None of those projects had been approved in any official vote. But the slideshow looked flashy, and some residents started wondering if maybe the dues were actually going somewhere useful after all. It was classic misdirection. So we fought back with clarity. I created a simple website called crestwoodtruth.com and posted every piece of evidence we had, cleanly organized, easy to understand, and completely factual. No rumors. Just receipts. Then we printed door hangers and walked the neighborhood. Want to know where your HOA dues are really going? The front said. The back listed bullet points with a link to the site. Within 4 days, the site had over 300 views. And with only 124 homes in the neighborhood, that meant people were really paying attention. And then, the real twist landed. Jen got a tip from someone who worked in records at the county office. Apparently, a small claim had been filed by a contractor, a real one this time, against Green Ridge Solutions for non-payment. That's right. Brad had subcontracted real work to someone and stiffed them, under a fake LLC. Jen got a copy of the case file. The contractor claimed they were hired to consult on landscaping and drainage improvements for a community park but were never paid the remaining $3,200 owed after completion. What caught our attention, though, was the description of the work, a tree removal project behind the clubhouse. Funny. That exact job was listed on our HOA ledger, but for $11,700. Which meant Brad's fake company pocketed the difference. Nearly $8,500. That was all we needed. The night of the special meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Easily the biggest turnout I'd ever seen. Brad opened the meeting with a smirk and a rehearsed monologue about rumors and misinformation. He even brought along his brother Tom, the one whose name was on the storage unit, and tried to pass him off as a landscape consultant. But then Diane stood up and asked for the floor. The room quieted. She calmly presented our case, backed by evidence, timelines, and documents. When Paul displayed a printed check issued to Green Ridge Solutions with Brad's home address as the remitter, the room fell silent. Then Jen dropped the bombshell, the unpaid contractor's lawsuit. She even read a quote from the contractor's statement. I was told the HOA had approved the budget, but later discovered I was working under a fake company name. When I tried to follow up, I was ghosted. Brad tried to interrupt. I think we've heard enough of this conspiracy. But that's when Mr. McMillan, the quiet man in the back, stood up and shouted. Then let's vote. Then let's vote. Mr. McMillan's voice cut through the tension like a hot knife through butter. You could feel the shift in the room, neighbors straightening in their chairs, side glances turning into firm nods. Brad's smirk faltered for the first time that night. We had reached the tipping point. Paul, ever the meticulous planner, stepped forward and raised his copy of the HOA bylaws. According to Section 7.3, any member meeting with a quorum present may propose a motion for removal of board members if malfeasance or financial misconduct is reasonably suspected. The room murmured. Eyes turned to each other, then to Brad, then back to Paul. I hereby move to begin a vote of no confidence in Brad Whitaker as HOA president, Paul said loud and clear. I second that, said Jen. And just like that, the floodgates opened. Diane started distributing ballots we had prepared, simple yes/no checkboxes with a tear-off verification slip at the bottom. Residents lined up one by one to cast their votes. Even the folks who'd remained skeptical earlier were now engaged. After all, when you're staring at proof that $8,500 disappeared in one transaction, it's hard to look away. Brad sat stiffly at the head of the table, jaw clenched, eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Tom, his landscaping consultant, had quietly slid out the back door. When all the votes were in, we tallied them with full transparency, right there on the projector screen. Yes to remove, 83. No to remove, 9. The remaining households hadn't shown, which wasn't unusual for a midweek meeting. But we had far exceeded the 60% needed to force a removal. Paul didn't gloat. He simply folded his hands and said, Motion passed. Just like that, Brad was out. The room exhaled as if someone had lifted a 500-pound weight off the neighborhood. But we weren't celebrating just yet. Because while removing Brad was step one, cleaning up his mess would be much harder. We immediately moved to appoint an interim board made up of respected neighbors, Diane, Paul, Jen, and a few others, including a retired CPA named Carla who volunteered to audit every cent the HOA had spent over the last 2 years. Brad stood to leave, grabbing his tablet and muttering something about lawyers and defamation. He got as far as the door when Mr. Macmillan called out again. "You might want to stick around." The projector changed slides. Carla had pulled the latest HOA account statements, and it was worse than we thought. Of the $118,000 in dues collected over 2 years, $75,400 was unaccounted for or paid to either Green Ridge Solutions or shell companies with similar addresses. That included Community Event Logistics, $6,200, no events had ever occurred. Security Infrastructure Consulting, $9,800, 0 security upgrades. Drainage Evaluation Services, $7,300, in an area with no flooding history. And the infamous Clubhouse Modernization, $14,000, which amounted to a single new Keurig machine. Carla had even highlighted repeated ATM withdrawals and purchases from big box stores that had no itemization. We were hemorrhaging money, and no one had been watching. Until now. The next morning, Jen filed a complaint with the county's HOA Oversight Division. We submitted every document, every photo, every receipt. Meanwhile, I contacted the contractor who had sued Green Ridge Solutions and asked if he'd be willing to speak to the press. He agreed. We knew it was time to take the story public. Within 48 hours, a local news outlet picked it up. HOA president removed amid allegations of $75,000 scam. Neighbors say it was a community betrayal. It was surreal watching the news crews roll through Crestwood Estates. Cameras pointed at the clubhouse. Reporters knocking on doors. Some residents refused to talk, embarrassed that they'd supported Brad so fiercely. But most were ready to move forward. And Brad? Oh, he wasn't done. He posted a 5-paragraph rant on the HOA Facebook page claiming he was the victim of a targeted witch hunt, and that certain individuals had fabricated financial reports. He even accused Paul and Carla of collusion. That post was removed within hours by the new admin team. And in its place? A formal apology to all residents and an invitation to the next board meeting, which would be open to the public and streamed online. Transparency wasn't just a buzzword anymore. It was the new rule. And that's when the big break came. The county investigator, after reviewing our documentation, issued a formal inquiry into Brad's activities. They also flagged a suspicious pattern. Green Ridge Solutions wasn't Brad's only shell company. He had used similar tactics in 2 other neighborhoods before moving to Crestwood Estates. That made it systemic. They reached out to those HOAs, one of which had already been dissolved, the other currently under new management. Both confirmed they'd had mysterious budget overruns during Brad's time in leadership. We handed all that to the district attorney. And then we waited. Meanwhile, things in Crestwood started to heal. The interim board froze all spending, halted auto-renewal of any contracts, and started monthly transparency reports. They even hosted a neighborhood block party, with actual receipts and a full itemized budget posted at the event. People came out of their homes again. Smiled. Talked to each other. The energy was different now. Lighter. At one point, a neighbor walked up to me and said, "I didn't believe you at first. Thought you were just stirring the pot. But you were right. Thank you. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because someone had to ask, where is the money going?" Now we knew. You'd think Brad would have taken the hint. The votes, the audit, the news coverage, it was all stacked against him. But ego is a powerful thing. And Brad? He wasn't going down without a fight. About a week after the news report aired, Paul got served. So did Carla. And me. Brad had filed a civil defamation suit claiming we had damaged his professional reputation and inflicted emotional distress. Yeah. The guy caught funneling HOA funds through fake shell companies was suing us. At first, we were stunned. Then we laughed. Then we got serious. We lawyered up again. Thankfully, we'd kept everything, every spreadsheet, every receipt, every email thread. And because it was a civil suit, our attorney countersued for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. The court would decide who was lying. We were ready. While the legal machinery turned, something else happened. Something that reminded me why this fight mattered. A young couple from down the street, Maria and Kevin, knocked on my door one evening. They looked nervous, like they weren't sure if they were doing the right thing. Maria handed me a manila envelope. "We found this in our mailbox," she said quietly. "It's from when Kevin worked part-time for Brad's landscaping crew. You might want to see it." Inside were 2 documents. One was a Green Ridge Solutions invoice dated 6 months prior for landscape resurfacing and mulching, $4,200. The other? A personal check from Brad Whitaker to Kevin for $300, labeled "Cash plus tip, good work." Here's the kicker. Kevin said the work they did was a quick 2-hour mulch drop-off behind the clubhouse. Nothing was resurfaced. No actual crew. Just Kevin, a rented pickup truck, and some cheap bark mulch from a local nursery. The rest of the $4,200? Poof. I handed the envelope to Paul. He added it to the growing file we were preparing for the DA. By now, the entire neighborhood was awake. It wasn't just about dues or documents, it was about trust. And that trust had been broken on every level. One elderly resident, Mr. Hutchins, showed up to the next open board meeting with a cane in one hand and a thick folder in the other. He'd been treasurer of an HOA back in the 90s and said this was the worst abuse of power he'd ever seen. He addressed the crowd slowly, deliberately. "You don't just lose $75,000 by accident. You hide it. You launder it. You funnel it where you think no one will check. And this man," he pointed right at Brad's empty chair, "did all 3. Thunderous applause followed. That's when the new board made a bold announcement. They were turning over everything to the state attorney general's office. Not just the financials. Not just the shell companies. But witness testimony, resident letters, and contractor statements. And there was one more bombshell. Carla, our interim treasurer, had tracked a series of online payments made to a company called BRH Ventures, LLC. Guess who owned it? Yup. Brad Raymond Whitaker. This company had received 3 payments from the HOA's general fund labeled consulting fees. One of them, $2,300, was transferred the same week the board approved. Emergency irrigation repairs. That never happened. Paul, who was now acting president, didn't hold back. He created a maze of fake businesses, moved money between them, and used HOA dues as his personal ATM. And he thought no one would ever put it together. But we had. Piece by piece. Document by document. That Friday, I got a call from a county official who had been quietly monitoring the situation. He thanked us for our diligence, and told me something that made all the frustration worth it. "We're opening a formal criminal investigation." The words hit me like a breath of fresh air. We weren't just neighborhood watchdogs anymore. This was official. And it meant Brad couldn't just walk away and play the victim. We passed the word around Crestwood. People were cautious but relieved. At the very least, we knew accountability was coming. About 2 weeks later, Brad's civil lawsuit against us was thrown out with prejudice. The judge reviewed the filings, looked at the volume of evidence against him, and called his case frivolous, retaliatory, and without merit. The courtroom was silent as our attorney responded, "Your Honor, we are submitting our countersuit." It was accepted without objection. Brad's face went pale. The media caught wind quickly. Another news story aired. Ousted HOA president sued after attempting to silence whistleblowers. Financial crimes investigation underway. I couldn't believe how far we'd come. The most poetic part? The new board began returning excess dues to residents. Carla found nearly $18,000 in misallocated funds that hadn't yet disappeared. They froze the outgoing payments and began issuing prorated refunds. It wasn't everything, but it was honest and symbolic. Neighbors started placing thank you signs in their yards. Kids chalked "Good job, HOA" on sidewalks. Someone even left homemade cookies on my porch with a sticky note that said, "You saved our neighborhood. We're lucky to have you." But I didn't save it. We all did. Together. And Brad? Last I heard, he'd packed up and left the state, just like he had the last 2 neighborhoods he scammed. Only this time, we followed the money. And now so was the law. The day the sheriff knocked on my door, I thought for a second it was more trouble. Instead, he handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a notice. Brad Whitaker had been officially indicted. 3 counts of wire fraud. 2 counts of misappropriation of funds. 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud. Turns out the criminal investigation went deeper than anyone expected. Remember those 2 other HOAs Brad had worked for? They'd also uncovered missing funds, and the same pattern of shell companies and fake invoices. It was a house of cards finally falling in on itself. The indictment document listed Crestwood Estates by name. And right there in the middle of the case summary were the words, "An HOA president who knowingly diverted more than $75,000 in dues for personal enrichment under the guise of community projects." That moment felt like closure. Not just for me, but for every neighbor who had written off their concerns. For the elderly couple who'd stretched their budget to pay higher dues. For the young parents who'd wondered why the park never got fixed. And for everyone who'd watched a man sit at the top and smile while their community fell apart. The trial date was set for early spring. Brad was arrested in a neighboring county and extradited back to face charges. The mugshot? Let's just say it didn't have the same confident grin he once wore to every HOA meeting. Paul, Carla, and I were called to testify. So were several residents, including Kevin, the part-time landscaper, and Maria, who kept her courage through the whole ordeal. We weren't just witnesses. We were the reason justice had a chance. The courtroom was packed. Local news outlets were seated in the back row. Brad, now with a public defender after his assets were frozen, tried to plead it all down to a mistake in accounting. But the prosecution laid it all out. Fake companies. Falsified invoices. Money trails leading to personal accounts. And a very telling email chain between Brad and a co-conspirator, joking about how these rubes never ask questions. Yeah. That one didn't sit well with the jury. It took them less than a day to return a verdict, guilty on all counts. Brad was sentenced to 7 years in state prison, with a mandatory restitution order of $85,000 split among the 3 neighborhoods he'd defrauded. Crestwood Estates would see at least a partial refund, and the state AG's office promised tighter future oversight on HOA financial activity, especially in suburban developments. It wasn't just a win. It was a message. Back home, the neighborhood began transforming. The clubhouse, once a source of frustration, became a true hub. Paul led free financial literacy workshops. Carla created a budgeting template any resident could view online. We even formed a rotating community committee to oversee all projects. No more secret votes, no more closed-door meetings. Transparency became our new culture. Kids started playing outside again. The walking trails got cleaned up, not by overpaid contractors, but by us, as a neighborhood. Diane organized a potluck every second Saturday, where we sat around picnic tables and talked like neighbors should. And the best part? The dues actually went down. By cutting out Brad's phantom expenses, the board saved thousands in unnecessary spending. What used to be $800 a year per household dropped to $520, with an emergency fund built in. Funny how affordable a community can be when you're not funding someone's getaway account. One evening, months after it all settled, I took a walk around the neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting that warm golden glow across the rooftops. I passed by the new flower beds, the freshly painted mailbox stands, the community bulletin board filled with flyers for garage sales and babysitter ads. At the far end of the cul-de-sac, I saw Mr. McMillan sitting on his porch. He waved me over and handed me a glass of lemonade. "You did good," he said quietly. "We all did," I replied. He smiled. "Still, it takes one person to ask the hard question." I sipped the lemonade and looked out over the neighborhood. You know what the real shame is? I said. Brad could have done something great here. He had the trust, the resources, the opportunity. Instead, he gambled it all for a few $1,000 and a fake title. Macmillan nodded. Greed makes you blind. But it also makes you sloppy. And you? You had the eyes to see it. So here's what I've learned. HOAs aren't evil by default. They're just vulnerable. When good people disengage, opportunists move in. They exploit the apathy, weaponize the rules, and hide behind red tape. But the moment someone stands up, asks to see the books, challenges a vote, demands a receipt, they panic. Because darkness doesn't survive light. And the best flashlight? Is a community that's awake. The next Crestwood Board election was the largest turnout in HOA history. People actually campaigned. Debates were held in the park. Flyers were dropped at every door. The vote was open, fair, and broadcast via Zoom. We elected a new board with diversity, experience, and most importantly, accountability. And for the first time in years, people didn't groan when the HOA meeting reminder showed up in their inbox. They opened it. They showed up. Because they knew the stakes. And because they'd learned, through fire and fraud, that silence is how scams survive. But not in Crestwood. Not anymore.